Good morning, and welcome to the webinar, AI Behind the Hype, Addressing Practical High-Impact Health Challenges. Before we begin, we wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, there are multiple application widgets you can use. All the widgets are resizable and movable. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget. We will try to answer these throughout and at the end of the event. A copy of today's slide deck and additional help materials are available in the resource list. We encourage you to download any resources or bookmark any links that you may find useful. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the help widget at the bottom of your screen. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available approximately 1 hour after the webcast and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Now I'll pass it over to our speakers from NVIDIA, NetApp, and Cambridge Consultants.
Hi, welcome. My name is Esteban Rubens. I'm with NetApp. I head up the AI and healthcare practice. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you're all staying healthy and safe and reasonably sane in this lockdown, and that everybody you know is doing likewise. Just a brief intro on myself. I've been in healthcare IT for over 15 years. I've been doing AI in healthcare for the last several years. I'm really lucky to be able to do something that I love, and my specific area of interest is this translation of the research that we have into clinical practice. So if you think about this, it's where the rubber meets the road, but in the case of AI in healthcare with NVIDIA and Cambridge Consultants and NetApp, it's more like when the racing slick hits the quarter-mile drag strip, because things are happening really, really quickly. So with that, I'll turn it over to David Labrosse.
Thanks. Happy to be here as well. A little bit of background on myself. Been in the industry 25 years or more, depending which side of the industry you look at. My background quickly is focused on genomics and life sciences today. Those are the areas of focus, but certainly with that, AI, of course, blended across all those areas. And then I've had the pleasure of serving my country, retired Air Force, and also had the pleasure of working in hospitals for 9 years. And that's my tie into the healthcare side.
Great, thank you, David. George.
Thanks, Esteban. So I work in strategic development for NVIDIA in genomics. And our team is working across the entire ecosystem, really, from instruments themselves to creating the actual sequence data. Once the data comes off the instruments, more secondary analysis to do de novo assembly or variant calling, those kinds of activities, and then downstream from that, actually taking and doing clinical reporting and or population studies across multiple sequences in a cohort sample. And so the team is looking at all of these areas, doing advances. We focus, well, actually, I'd say flip it around. We're a little bit agnostic on whether we do sort of traditional approaches and accelerate them or apply AI and deep learning. But obviously, for the sake of today's call, there is AI in all of those segments that I mentioned. And then NVIDIA's healthcare team, just more broadly, certainly is engaged in medical imaging and smart hospitals and so on. And so I'm happy to talk about that a little bit as well, to the extent I know about it.
Great, thank you so much. Rahul.
Thanks, Esteban. I'm Rahul Sathe. I work with Cambridge Consultants. We are a global engineering, design, and science firm where we help clients solve complex problems across sectors, ranging from medical devices to satellite to agritech. Our focus is really on next-generation products and systems in concept through to manufacture, and really how do we drive healthcare advancement and business success. My particular role is to oversee large R&D teams, really focused on advanced surgical systems. So that's everything from robotics to sensor-rich tools, to critical care equipment, and to smart implants. My particular passion is focusing on the future of surgery. So where is surgical care headed over the next 10 years? And really looking forward to the conversation with our partners in NVIDIA and NetApp. In particular, we've seen some great trends around AI and looking forward to the conversation today.
Great. Thank you so much. So now to get into it, I thought it would be interesting to start talking about where you see AI today. Obviously we're focusing on healthcare and life sciences. There's a lot of hype, obviously, but there's also a lot of actual work being done, success, implementations in actual clinical settings. So it's always good to kind of set that stage for where we're at today. So Rahul, what do you think?
It's a great question. So AI today, and I'll take the lens perhaps more on the surgery side, and I think my colleagues will comment more broadly. But surgery tends to be 10 to 15 years behind adoption of new technology. 5-10 years ago, having high definition 4K monitors was a new thing. And so while we're slow to adopt, I think it's become clear to healthcare providers, to world-class hospitals, to surgeons that AI holds significant promise. And so what we're seeing today is sort of getting our feet wet in using AI and ML techniques. So for example, we are familiar with efforts in using AI to do image enhancement in particular. So think in the world of laparoscopy, as you're cutting and cauterizing tissue, there's naturally smoke occurring, debris occurring. We're able to remove those artifacts from the visual field to help the surgeon see better. We're seeing clearly in the diagnostics world where AI is being used to analyze thousands of CT scans and MR scans to help clinicians better triage diagnosis of disease. So it's really in the image enhancement area that we've seen AI perhaps make the biggest splash today. And I think we'll talk more about this in the future. But as we start to pivot from image enhancement into clinical decision making, that's where we'll see the short term headed towards the long term.
Great. Thank you. So, George, what do you think about that?
Well, so to pick up on something that Rahul talked about, and he mentioned sort of CT scans. So I think one cool study that was just announced, or initiative really, with the NIH, NVIDIA was looking at lung scans, CT scans of lungs, specifically for the case of COVID-19. And they're trying to assess, I guess what it was trained on was thousands of cases with COVID-19 and without. But the goal is obviously to have a very fast way to screen and determine if somebody might have COVID-19 when they're in the hospital. And in a sense, the CT is a very available equipment for that. The other, obviously, way to test for COVID-19 is more of the blood test that you do a PCR analysis. That's my home in genomics, but that actually takes a little bit more time, and is often you have to send it away somewhere to get the work. So this work by the NIH was really nice for making that immediately available.
Yeah, that's really interesting. David?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts, just echo what the folks just contributed. We're seeing a lot of activity around accelerating analytics, in particular in life sciences and pharmaceuticals. We all know that it takes years and millions of dollars to develop any new drug, but the shift that we're seeing in light of the pandemic and in light of advancements in AI is that more and more of the pharmaceutical and general research organizations are using AI to do what we would call reanalysis. So that means if they have pre-existing drugs or compounds that they formerly utilized and or didn't utilize, but put them aside, we're finding more and more they're reanalyzing and revisiting because some of those prior drugs or discoveries could be applicable to something today, perhaps like the pandemic. So we're seeing AI, again, accelerate those processes and those discoveries like never before.
Yeah, and I was thinking, of course, to get any of these things done and implement in clinical practice, there are two things that seem to be important. One is to respect the existing workflows, because we know that people are burnt out in healthcare and you can't just deploy new things and expect everyone to learn new apps. And the other one is to bring things together from an infrastructure perspective. So you need the compute that NVIDIA has with GPUs, and really cool announcement on the A100. Certainly love seeing Jensen's Kitchen for sure. and networking, right, on the 100 gig and 400 gig Ethernet. Then you need data storage and data management and sort of moving data very seamlessly between on-prem and cloud. That's what we bring to the table. And then you need the brain power to put it all together, like you guys at Cambridge Consultants can do to, create the models and train them and deploy them. So if you think about it, it's almost like this is something that needs a lot of participants to happen. And maybe just thinking about another example and seeing if you have a couple others in imaging, right? So NVIDIA has Clara, and it's an SDK, so you need people to sort of implement that. One example I've read about that is quite interesting involving genomics as well is with gliomas, these brain tumors, where there are some treatments that work only for a very specific mutation. Usually that requires taking a sample of the tumor and basically running the gene sequence of the tumor cells. But it turns out that you can feed MRI images of the tumor into a properly trained neural network, and you get exactly the same kind of result in terms of prediction of the mutation by analyzing those images. So, and that's something that's available today. That's not science fiction. It's not sort of pie in the sky, would be nice to do. Does that remind you of anything else or any other examples or maybe comments on how this kind of thing comes together in the real world?
Sure. So I can think of two really interesting examples. One that's both are real and very near term. One out of academic research, and then one that's actually being rolled out to hundreds of thousands of patients. So on the academic side, Stanford has been doing some very interesting research. I almost view it as sort of early, low sample size pilot studies where they've been able to train AI and deep learning algorithms to really detect brain aneurysms. And I think it was about 250 patients recently published where radiologists hand-tagged the training data and showed equivalent, if not slightly better, detection rates and sensitivity and specificity than radiologists with significant experience. And so I think we're going to see a lot of this over the next few years where small studies which are linking direct pathological data to diagnosis and to treatment will become more mainstream. On the broader, grander scale, in particular in emerging markets, hospital systems are taking advantage of AI to really democratize care. So Apollo Hospitals in India, they've been partnering, I believe, with Microsoft to take cohorts of patient data in cardiovascular disease to better triage patients. So are patients at a high risk or low risk? Should they be seen by a cardiologist, a general practitioner? How do you access the tier 2, tier 3 clinics for perhaps patients who don't have care? So some really interesting models coming out, and these are all happening in real time now.
Yeah, so that's definitely beyond the hype. So George or David?
So going back to your comment, I think it is interesting because I think to a certain degree, AI has been around a while, but still a lot of people who are, either in the clinic or in research somewhere with a focus on biology or whatever it is, they know their domain pretty well. And to them, AI is still new. And so I think a lot of people are sort of taking it, at least up until now, has been more, what am I doing today? What could AI help with this thing that I'm doing, right? And so it's, I don't want to make it sound incremental because some of these are fundamentally breaking through, say, an accuracy barrier that people couldn't get trying to tease out with a traditional method. A good example of this is like AI is really good at denoising data, and that's across, wherever you'd apply it. But one project we did with Harvard, with Jason Buonestro there, was around single-cell sequencing, and specifically ATAC-seq. And so the idea with that is that you're looking at chromatin accessible areas of the genome, and that, that accessibility is a proxy for gene expression, and so therefore you can understand, epigenetics better. But what often happens, especially in single cell, where you might get, low sample coverage, let's say, or sample quality, it gets really hard to figure out where those peaks are, and you lose it into the noise, so to speak. So that was a case where we worked with them, and that's recently been published, but it very easily you can clean up those spectra using deep learning and suddenly get much higher accuracy in how you call those peaks. And so that fundamentally changes what you can accomplish with your research, or by extension, if it's being used in a diagnostic manner, how accurate your test could be. So
great. So yeah, more for the researcher, and then that kind of cascades back to the patient.
Right.
And David?
Yeah, I was going to add that I agree with everything everyone's sharing in terms of analytics and supporting diagnostics. And one quick example, we're working with an organization in Germany called Hanover Medical School. You might have heard of them. They have great success in researching COPD, lung disease, that many people are familiar with. And that comes to light more and more today as we look at, unfortunately, at the pandemic and how it actually is a higher risk for those with pre-existing conditions like COPD. What we found impressive was how Hanover Medical School, led by Dr. Winter, had utilized AI technology to help accelerate dramatically the time it takes to analyze and scan the images and thereby come up with a faster diagnosis of COPD. And I think there's other examples we could cite, but it is exciting because, as described, the research itself is now moving so much faster. It's actually going and becoming something that can achieve great outcomes at the end of point of care. So we're really excited about those examples, and we look at it becoming more mainstream in time.
Great. So yeah, maybe now going a little beyond from what's being done today to the very near future in the next few years, one thing that comes to mind just seems to be a common factor in a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is something that I care about, maybe not super important, but I think it's important to have labels kind of depict things correctly. So we talked about AI, everybody talks about artificial intelligence. If you think about all the examples that we were talking about, it seems that it's really more about augmented intelligence, right? Like we're making people smarter, or we're giving time back to people. We're Rahul, you were talking about kind of image enhancement and kind of removing extraneous things like smoke and debris. What do you think about that idea that, AI, because a lot of people obviously, especially in, healthcare and the sciences, there's this current of anxiety about AI taking jobs away or AI replacing people. And I think there's a pretty clear agreement that AI is more about augmentation, and you always need to have the human in the loop, especially in healthcare. So what's your reaction to that, George?
So, yeah, I mean, so I think in one sense, AI is expert systems, right? And so you think about the person you just described in a role in the hospital, they are an expert. Oftentimes they're distracted by, mundane things. And if you can take all of that away and, make them more efficient, and they can do the part that, they were trained for, I think that's important. I think it isn't, I mean, we talk about, finding an AI trained to find something in an image or something too. I think it's important to remember a lot of the revolution of AI in healthcare is going to be not very sexy. It's going to be operational efficiency, getting samples or equipment to the right place at the right time. The same thing that Walmart does, but within the hospital, just making it more, And so, of course, we love to talk about the cool new diagnosis, but I think a lot of the real value to organizations is going to be just on those kinds of things.
Yeah, interesting. David?
Yeah, sorry for the delay. I had a dog in the background. I guess it's live. So thanks. Yeah, it's interesting because I was just reading articles. We all have these stories out there. Some we work on directly, some indirectly. There was a quick story about a patient that came in, apparently had a stroke led by some type of blood clot. And as described by George accurately, you know, today and in the past, they would just quickly do everything they can and try to determine, you know, what is the cause of the problem, the stroke itself, how to, you know, with a very tight time window, you respond. And I think the interesting thing about the article was they emphasized how they used capabilities with AI to scan and identify that blood clot faster in the brain, and then did a very quick procedure with that knowledge that they could actually act upon that knowledge. And then sadly, they used another article as a comparison where they had another patient who did not do as well because they did not have the AI capabilities to do the image analysis, and thereby that patient passed away. So again, I think like you're saying, George and Raul and everyone else, these are real world scenarios that are now being addressed directly by AI. And one of my thoughts, like probably everyone else, is how soon can we get it into the hands of these, you know, pathologists and surgeons and oncologists, so they can do the ultimate step, which is to do a accelerated and an improved point of care model.
Yeah, absolutely. Rahul? Or, sorry, George.
Yeah, that's okay. Sorry, I was going to give another example, I think, where you can help a lot in a hospital without, you know, in any way impacting the expert. And that's things like, how would I say it? You know, in the smart hospital sense of the cameras and sensors within the hospital being used for patient monitoring, for public monitoring. It can be security aspects. So a good and again contemporary example of this would be a temperature screening or a thermal screening product by Whiteboard Coordinator. And this is already deployed in a number of hospitals. And that can, in real time, watch, I think it's 2,000 people per minute coming through a checkpoint, and it checks, you know, it can check if they're wearing a mask, so that kind of compliance. It can check thermal screening versus background temperature to see if somebody has elevated temperature. And, you know, yes, you can have somebody there, you know, checking those things, but A, it would be slow things down, and B, you know, if you can take people away from that, you're lowering their risk, right? If it's an automated thing. So again, a lot of different ways that we can help the practitioners or the people on the front lines rather than, you know, taking away in any sense. You know, back to your original question.
Right. Rahul, sorry, we interrupted.
So your comment on supporting the expert really resonates with me. In the world of surgery, you know, high risk decisions still need to stay in the hands of the surgical team. And I think surgical care, hospitals, and patients will continue to expect that for a long time. So the proposition of AI and ML is the strongest where there are lower risk factors, but improved efficiencies in cost, workflow, higher confidence in getting to decisions faster. Surgery is a team-based sport. And so if AI techniques can be used to help the dozen or so folks in an OR understand what tools are needed by when, to help ensure that that patient has the latest and greatest in real-time decision-making. Our teams have been actively exploring how to help incorporate AI and ML techniques into that arena, and I think we'll see that over the next few years. I think the other thing that comes to mind is, at the end of the day, the proposition has to be about how are we either improving outcomes, reducing risk, or reducing the total cost of care. And if AI isn't able to attend to any one of those three factors, then it's not getting the job done, and there are plenty of other approaches to doing what needs to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So in that direction, a little further, what do you think the barriers are to getting adoption realized, right, in the next 1 to 3 to maybe 5 years? Because clearly the technology is there, right? We have plenty of examples. Do you think it's on the technology side, it's access to data, it's regulation? What do you see out there in terms of barriers to implementation? Rahul, if you've seen anything.
Sure, Sure, I can start and I'll let the guys expand on it. I think there's two lenses to this. The first is being able to link ground truth clinical data to the AI techniques that are being employed. I think you're absolutely right. There will be hundreds, if not thousands, of companies in the near future that are well versed in AI. The challenge will be is linking those very strong capabilities to what is actually happening at tissue, what is actually happening in that genetic sequence, and pairing that insight. It takes the other lens, which is how do you bring multiple partners together? It's a very complex problem because the information on the clinical side is owned by patients, by hospitals, by insurance providers, and it's the technology players like NVIDIA, like ourselves, like NetApp, like many others that bring the capability. Stitching that partnership together in a way that can make sense business-wise, economically, clinically for everyone is probably one of the biggest barriers over the coming few years.
Right. It's certainly the case that no individual or even no institution has everything that's needed to make that come to pass. And it's, the data, the expertise, the technology, all of the pieces coming together at the right place at the right time. I think certainly just about every example we talked about involved some level of collaboration and some engagement across multiple institutions. So I think definitely toward that and an interesting development is the idea of federated learning. I think that helps in a lot of cases to overcome barriers. One of them would be, who has the data versus who has, who can make the model. And federated learning is the idea that you keep the data local, but you have the model global, if you will. And so any individual institution can contribute to the accuracy of the overall model with their own data. And a good example is, sort of rare diseases where any given institution might only have a couple patients with this case. So you don't have enough data to train a model on your own, but it's in aggregate you can. So if you can do some kind of local batch training and share the weights up, everybody in the community benefits from the model that can be developed from all of them. And so I think that's certainly something that is helping to break down some of the barriers to advancing some of these technologies. I certainly, as Rahul pointed out, there are other barriers in place as well. So,
yeah, David, what do you see on the infrastructure side in terms of barriers?
Yeah, so I want to echo as I get into that question. The challenges with data, right? We know coming from a genomics point of view, especially, no one has all the data, right? We need more data as described to have more accuracy in our analytics. But what we often hear and we all know and respect is the challenges with de-identification of data. It goes hand in hand with those data lakes that are out there today. Is that data, typically in a research setting, de-identified, and is that the standard practice as we see mostly today? And of course, how does that carry over to the more clinical side where we, of course, the HIPAA compliance becoming a challenge. And again, it ties into AI objectives here because, we have to comply, we're indicated. And we also add some other thoughts to this. We also have to look at the biases side because the data that we access or the data that we gather could inherently have biases in it, whether it's the population biases or, different variable biases like male versus female. As we do some of these analytics, we really need to make sure as we develop the algorithms, as we develop the applications of the AI technology, that we are not either limiting our capabilities by having not the right data or the right volumes of data, or that when we do the algorithms themselves, we're not, inherently creating biases that could unfortunately impact the outcome of a patient's treatment and such. So there are a lot of interesting things that are out there today, and I don't want to cover this next topic too deeply, but I know access is a huge thing in terms of what we all know in technology being available to third world countries and things like that. So I'm going to hand that off to Rahul. I think there's some great stories to tell around access to this technology. And in particular, I'm thinking about the opportunity you guys had in the range of tuberculosis. If you could comment on that, that would be great.
Sure. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Yep. So I can touch on that at a very high level. So our teams have been exploring different ways to help manage TB diagnosis in emerging markets. So we've been working very closely with some world-leading NGOs in this space to identify what are those needs. In particular, if you think about China, India, Africa, and in some cases, mid-tier clinics, some of it is about the technology, but some of it is around workflow and understanding the user-centered side of things, right? How do patients engage with the care pathway at a societal level? Are they willing to identify that they have an issue? In many emerging markets, clinicians are viewed as a very hierarchical situation where they dictate care to patients. So there's a user-centric side to this as well. But it's been a very interesting story to pair the deep AI techniques with the usability side to be able to actually impact care for patients in emerging markets.
Yeah, so maybe a bit of a combination of the emerging markets and federated learning, this idea that obviously we know data has a lot of value. There's been a lot written in the last few years about that, data's in the oil, et cetera, et cetera. So do you think that in terms of extracting, in a way, that value from the data to benefit patients, some of the changes that we've seen due to the pandemic may stick around? Like, there's been so much better data sharing. There's at a global scale, and it looks like, yes, some of the regulations that we had, HIPAA, GDPR, other national mandates, are extremely well intentioned, but it turns out that given a sufficiently important situation, some things can be relaxed, and we can get some sanity, right, where sharing data for the greater good is like technically possible. What do you think? Do you think there's a reasonable chance that may stick around and research may be improved, or researchers may benefit from this? Rahul, if you've seen anyone really, or David, George.
Yeah,
I've certainly seen. Oh, go ahead, Rahul.
So I think my only comment there was, I suspect we will. So it's going to come down to scale. So I suspect we will see focused research efforts out of academic institutions on small pilot studies where they can have some control. But the challenge there is, to David's point, you have small cohorts. They're very objective. How real world is it? And so what I'm interested to see is how do you get the big scale players? How do you get entire hospital systems, Partners Healthcare in the Massachusetts area, right? Big hospital systems willing to say, we are going to invest billions of dollars to make sure that we've got global data that can be applied locally to patient of one. And that's, I'm curious to see who's going to dip their toes in the water on that first.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, Rahul. And I think, to a certain degree, the solution rises to the size of the problem, right? And so obviously in the current disaster, as you said, Esteban, there is a softening or an opening of how things are treated so that, we can quickly address the pandemic. It'll be interesting to see if lessons are learned that are going to be able to be taken long term. I think certainly one thing that'll happen as people become more familiar with the tools, they will realize that, oh, we applied this successfully here. Now let's try and apply it in some other area that's not specifically the pandemic. And I think that sort of knowledge never goes away. So I think there will be certainly an escalation in that sense of how people are approaching these problems.
Great. David, anything on that subject?
No, I think they covered it pretty well. I think we're going to see some things carry over after the pandemic hopefully goes away. I like your points about, sharing data. I think everybody wants to do that, holistically from a betterment of mankind and the population. I do think a little bit differently in the sense that we do see some challenges where people look at their hard discovered research as intellectual property, if you will. I think that comes into the discussion at some point. But I think you're right. For the greater good, hopefully we see more folks sharing data, using the AI tools that come along with that. But there will be some element, as we know, of intellectual property concerns, and that'll have to be addressed as well.
Great. So maybe let's switch gears a little bit and think about the future. So we have some time for questions later on. So of course, hard to talk about the future and not fall to the hype. So maybe trying to stay a bit grounded on what you think is possible. We all work in large visionary organizations, of course, Cambridge Consultants, NVIDIA, NetApp. We hear a lot of extremely cool stuff. So from that universe of things that we've been exposed to, what do you think is a reasonable guess? Of course, predicting the future is always complicated, right? But in the next maybe 10 years, right? What visionary things do you think are going to be more commonplace than today, are going to be adopted in a way that we don't quite see today in ultimately healthcare, things that may benefit patients, whether it's on the genomic side or the imaging side or the pathology side, whatever that may be. So, anyone want to take a stab at that?
I could jump in on that future focus. Sure. One thing we're seeing, I think others would share the same, is telemedicine, telehealth is not going to go back into the cave. It wasn't always in the cave. It was coming out of the cave. But now that we're seeing it needed everywhere, especially with the pandemic, I would predict in 10 years that telemedicine, telehealth will be way more mainstream, and then complementing that will be the enhanced sensors and features that would be enabled by AI. So I would put telehealth, telemedicine on the list of things to really look closely at going forward, because I don't think we put that genie back in the bottle now that there's such a high dependency on it today.
Absolutely. Any other takers for the predictions?
So maybe two thoughts. The first is I think back to maybe a more legacy industry like aircraft. So GE aircraft, they used to sell engines. They now sell thrust, right? They sell the capability to power airplanes in a serviced way, and they back it by sensors, analytics, and increasingly digital twins. So GE has a digital twin for, I think, almost every one of their engines that are up in the air at the moment, where they can model predictively the performance of that engine, how to fine tune it, how to tailor it for that particular airline or that particular geographic route across Asia Pacific. And so that's been around for a while. And I have a feeling that 10 years from now, we will see the prevalence of digital twins at different layers. Now, I don't think we're going to see digital twins of people yet, but I could imagine digital twins of hospitals, right? Hospitals running emergency scenarios, thinking through efficiency, training, staff allocation. We may see digital twins of procedures where entire surgical teams are practicing before they play on a very complex 12-hour heart transplant. So I think the techniques are there, the tools are there. What I don't think will change, though, is the ultimate decision making being wrested away from those experts, right? Those clinicians. That's where hundreds of years of medical science has been institutionalized. So I think AI will be a more powerful tool to enable those good decision making.
Right.
And I guess I would agree with both of David and Rahul's point. I guess one other thing I would say is where I see things going, or maybe where a lot of the successes we talked about today and near term are focused really, in my mind, still on single modality. It's one type of data that they can get additional insight into, and so that's great. But I think the holy grail is still multimodality. Where you're combining genomics information on a patient and their tumor versus image information of what that tumor really looks like, or slides of the tumors and where else it might be, and patient data that talks about what their treatment record was, and over time, and you're tracking all of these different things, and that the total the grail of personalized medicine really has to combine all of these things. It's not a single point, single device, single anything. So, and I think we're starting to see progress in that direction, but I definitely think that's a 3 to 5 year window where it's really going to start being adopted widely.
Well, we hear a lot about IoT and kind of the associated Internet of Medical Things. Do you think there's much of an intersection there? Do you think, so I know NVIDIA's putting GPUs in modalities, like imaging modalities, and there's kind of AI embedding into a lot of different things, like from glucose meters to gene sequencers to any number of other things. There's talk about smart toilets and smart mirrors. What do you think is going to happen in that mid-range future with the IoT in healthcare and AI?
So I definitely think that's really big. The whole smart hospitals, I think I've called it, but it's basically the Internet of Things for hospitals, with every camera, every sensor, every pulse meter, everything, being monitored and collected and tracked. Toward that, NVIDIA, I think you opened by mentioning our Clara framework for, it's an application framework for healthcare and life sciences. The initial pillar there was medical imaging. And so Clara Medical is still there. But we also have Clara Parabricks, which is the genomics solutions. And then now Clara Guardian, which is really about the edge detection and smart sensors, intelligent video analytics, speech recognition, all of those little pieces too. So those are now all collectively under Clara, in part to enable this idea of multimodality and connecting disparate data sets together to do a bigger picture solution. So.
Just to build on your comments. Just to build on George's comments, the trends that our AI teams and digital health teams are seeing is increasingly one of complex systems coming together to solve unmet needs. And our teams are working very hard at ensuring that our capability is really not just about AI algorithms and techniques and learning, but actually how is that one building block in a system that can get the job done. And we're firm believers that 10 years from now, it's entirely possible that AI techniques are a commodity, right? It'll actually be how our systems coming together to deploy the right tools in the right way under the right business models to make that impact sustainable. So that's kind of the question that we're constantly wrestling with, and many of our clients are as well.
And David, I was thinking, we're talking about smart hospitals and complex systems. Everything gets more complex. In the end, the amount of data that is generated is just staggering, right? We have a lot of data now. There's going to be just orders of magnitude more. So how do you handle that?
Yeah, great point. So I'll use a quick example that we referenced earlier. So genomics, genetic testing is only increasing because the cost is coming down, and the impact of genetic testing is phenomenal. I think most of us know that today. And then to your point, the amount of data that goes out the door now for genetic or genomic sequencing is in line with hundreds of gigabytes, if not higher. So the point and the question you're asking is, how does that get managed, right? These large volumes of files, where do they go? The average hospital is ready for some of this, but probably not for all of it as it becomes mainstream. And then I think another angle on the data that we all focus on is who really owns that data. Depending on who you talk to, there's different degrees of emphasis. Certainly some legal teams will say, well, of course, the patient owns all the data, but then there's other folks out there doing perhaps drug discovery or doing important work in research. They might have the point of view like, well, we have it de-identified, so we own the storage. So I agree. I think there's going to be high volumes to manage. I think our technologies are going to help with that. I think the bigger challenges, again, will be, well, we have all this data. Who really should have it? Who should maintain it? Who should be the stewards of the data? And I think there's a lot of topics and questions around that we need to address going forward.
Absolutely. And I just had a thought. So maybe, Rahul, you can answer this. You guys are sort of the tip of the spear, right? You bring everything together and you provide complete solutions. So how can you maybe walk through a little bit what that looks like? You go and you find a problem that one of your customers wants to solve and, say surgery, right? Your area. And so you have to bring together, what NVIDIA has, what NetApp has, what maybe other partners have. That seems like very complex as well, and just curious about how it all works.
Well, I have the personal pleasure of working with a lot of folks who are much smarter than I, and what I'm amazed by every day is the amount of talent, sort of passion, and kind of the collaboration, and it's a joy to see. I think, like most folks probably, we want to ensure that the work that we're doing is making a positive impact to solve a tough problem. And so many of our programs really start with, well, it's got to be needs driven. What are the unmet needs? What are we really trying to solve here? And if there's a better way to do that, a simple way of doing that doesn't require a lot of technology, then we're all for that. So it really comes down to, right, needs driven. It has to be business enabled to make an impact. And then many of our programs involve close partnerships with manufacturers, with technology partners, with great folks across NVIDIA and NetApp, so we can bring these solutions to ultimately patients. At the end of the day, we all know patients, or in 10 years' time, we will all be patients. And so the question is, do we feel comfortable with whatever we're putting out there that it would help one of our loved ones? And so that's really at the heart and soul of what we try to do.
That's great. Thank you. So just want to be mindful of the time and go to some audience questions. One here that is sort of related to something, actually, Rahul was mentioned before, the aircraft engine thing. How can the healthcare industry benefit from AI advances in other industries? Anybody who wants to jump in?
I'll jump in on that one right away. So I can think of a very clear example, but maybe first describe that in our healthcare team at NVIDIA, we obviously have domain experts, but we have at our backs the entire company and a lot of people, great engineers that have expertise in other domains. And a good example, in a sense a small example, but a very perfect to your point, we work with Oxford Nanopore, who's a sequencer manufacturer. And so their challenge on the instrument is taking this electronic signal that comes in and converting it into nucleotides, the ACTG alphabet of sequence, right? And looking at that, it kind of struck us that this is a problem that looks very much like speech to text, right? You've got a signal coming in and you convert it into an alphabet, right, in whatever language. And so they were able to take QuartzNet, which is from speech recognition, and apply that model, and then within like a week have a base caller that was similar quality and performance to what they'd spent years trying to develop. And now, of course, since then, they've taken it and optimized it further. But those kinds of insights that you can gain from another industry certainly make a big impact on what direction should you be going. So.
Great, thank you. Let's see. There's one here about pathology and how, it's a big question, obviously, but how AI is impacting and maybe changing and benefiting pathology in healthcare.
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. What we're seeing lately with pathologists in particular, as we all know that they do 70% or more of the diagnoses in healthcare settings, and what they've relied on historically have been a lot of the glass slides that they have to manually look at, and finding ways to automate that is huge. But I think we're also seeing, and you folks have said this as well, is a factor that the human element of doing that is now being somewhat overridden by AI, because obviously AI has capabilities that are beyond the human eyesight and can identify things like cancer cells in many cases faster than a pathologist. So I think there's mixed feelings about that. Some folks feel like, well, you're taking my job or you're replacing a pathologist. But of course, we all know that's not the case. We're augmenting and we're giving them more capabilities. But beyond that, I think what's interesting is how other technologies like genomic sequencing are coming into play. And as we know, unfortunately, with cancer analysis and diagnosis, you need to have as much data as you can get, because every cancer is a little bit different for each patient. And so when they go forward, they want to achieve what we all hear about as the precision medicine or the personalized medicine goals. But to get there, to really achieve that, you need to have combined sources and combined analytics. So from a pathology point of view, my point of view on that is that we will, in time, provide better tools. And I think in time, these technologies will make the job a little bit easier and faster, hopefully. And I think what we all said earlier is that we do risk in today's healthcare industry a burnout factor, that if we don't provide these tools that augment or enable them to do things better and faster, we do have a risk of some of our best and brightest frontline healthcare professionals are just not going to be able to sustain their careers, at least in my opinion.
Thank you. If anybody wants to jump in too, I'm just going to go through a few other questions that we're getting. Somebody's asking about, is there a matchmaking service for AI? So basically, if there's maybe this is more for Rahul, if somebody has a problem in healthcare that they would like to solve, is there a service provider who will help apply AI to solve problems? I think that's what the question is asking.
Sure, and probably behind that question is probably another question, which is around just how do you navigate the multiple organizations out there that are working in the fields related to AI, right? And let's be honest, AI is easily misconstrued as a buzzword of the day, and in many ways it can be. So I think our general advice there would be have a well-defined problem statement and kind of break it down into what are you really trying to solve, and then certainly reaching out to folks like George and David and myself and yourself, Esteban, if we can provide guidance, happy to do that. But defining the problem up front and then trying to understand how does that break down into technologies, business, clinical, and then working with the right partners to navigate that.
Great, thank you. So we touched on this a little bit before. There's a question about, and this is something that gets discussed a lot, the democratization of AI and how to bring the benefit of AI to really the whole world, to go from, and I've heard people, certainly NVIDIA people too, talk about the scale up benefit, right? Going from one patient to a global scale and helping patients at that scale. What are your thoughts on that, and what are organizations doing to help with that, so that it's not something that just, AI in healthcare just benefits people in North America and maybe Western Europe?
So if there's a few things that some of our teams are exploring, and we're taking that from a user perspective. So in some cases, if the users are surgeons and well-trained clinical teams, then what we see is technologies being able to harness data that they understand, can interpret, and presenting it in predictive ways. That there's a whole set of activities that we're looking at there. But if you think about from a patient standpoint, right? Some patients are very well informed and connected. Others are not, and so the challenge always becomes: is using AI appropriate? And so we're seeing, for example, in post-treatment cases, patients who need specific rehab, providing patient coaches, where think Siri for your health. So we've been exploring some of those sorts of things. I guess the last comment I want to make is there's the push and then there's also a pull. So in the U.S., health records and EMR is a big challenge and has been. In India, surgeons have been using WhatsApp for a long time to text CT scans back and forth to consult on difficult cases, right? And so when you've got healthcare systems that lack infrastructure or have infrastructure challenges, I think we'll see faster adoption of cloud-based, analytics-based techniques like AI.
Yeah, I think adding on to what Rahul said, technology enables things. In one sense, we've talked a lot again about the, bigger, better, something you couldn't do before, but technology will enable, again, the efficiency and shrinking of things. So I know a lot in devices that has enabled it for other countries is being able to shrink them down to make them more portable, less power dependent, use them off the grid, those kinds of situations. And I think, again, to a certain degree, the whole world benefits from that kind of thing, but probably less so those of us in developed countries because we do have the infrastructure that we don't need it as much, right?
Right. So we only have a few minutes left. We could go on for hours, but I won't subject our audience to that. We'll wrap it up. I thought maybe a reasonable thing to do would be some kind of call to action, right? To leave people with something that is more actionable than whatever descriptions we've been talking about. And I'll start. So I think what I would say is the barrier to entry is quite low, right? Things are such that it's really possible to get started without a lot of investment. You can go to GitHub, you can get models that you can train, you can learn on Coursera, you can learn from any number of world-class universities that are making their classes available for free online. If you can't get a DGX A100 quite yet, you can go get a couple of GPUs and stick them in a box and, start doing some model training in deep learning and, figure something out and so on and so forth, right? So that I think is my call to action, that anybody who's interested in AI and is working in healthcare should just go ahead and do it. Obviously, I understand people don't have time sometimes, but it's not this daunting thing, and it's not only reserved to experts, and it's not only reserved to people who have some kind of credential. That this is really something that everybody should be contributing to, because A, we need everybody's ideas, and B, everybody around the world will have different problems that require different approaches.
I'll build on what you said, Esteban. And tie back into, Rahul's statements earlier about, it takes sort of a network of experts. Others have the data. So I can imagine there are, a clinician who might not be ready to start programming a deep learning framework, but, they have the patients, they're connected with that, cohort of people who, have this rare disease. And so that's what they can really bring in. And so don't look to solve it yourself. Look to bring in others. Some of us on the call, there's obviously this idea of a network of other experts. And, pull together and we can solve these problems, definitely working together as a team. So.
Great, thank you. Great. Rahul or David, last thoughts?
I think, look, I certainly agree with both of you. And from my perspective, this is about solving challenging problems that haven't been solved before. And if there's any silver lining in sort of the situation at the moment, is you see individuals, communities, organizations coming together in ways that perhaps they wouldn't have otherwise. And so I guess it's my, being the eternal optimist, it's my personal hope that we'll see that trend continued even beyond these challenging times, to where we are bringing different capabilities together, multimodal sensing, AI, clinical problems, IoT, analytics, genomics, right, in a way that's never been done before. So let's keep our eyes open to that horizon and see what we can do.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we all see the taglines out there, together, we're here as experts across the board here to have conversation to enable these organizations to do more things together. And it's not just technology, certainly it's about their business cases, their clinical environments, and that's why we're here. So we're glad to help in any way we can.
Thank you. Well, we'll wrap it up then. David Labrosse, George Vasek, Rahul Sathe, thank you very much. Thank you to the audience, everyone who stayed on this long. Have a great day and stay safe out there.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Esteban. Thanks, George. Thanks, Rahul.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you everyone for attending our webinar. We hope you found it interesting and informative. As a reminder, an on-demand version of the webcast, as well as associated resources mentioned earlier, will be sent out in approximately 1 hour. So thank you and have a great rest of your day.